Are you struggling with playing first-person shooters on the Steam Deck? It's not your fault. The default control settings are not optimal. Here's how I changed them for first-person and third-person shooters. First, in the Steam system-wide settings, go to Controller, then Calibration and Advanced Settings. Lower the default joystick dead zones from the very high default of 8000. If you observe drift in a game, raise it back up bit by bit until it goes away. You can also customize dead zones per game, as I'll show later. Also, if you experience gyro drift, whether with the deck or with a connected controller, recalibrate it for that device here. Quick aside, in the controller settings, you can also customize the desktop mode layout. Note that by default, the left trackpad acts as a circular scroll wheel, so you swipe clockwise and counterclockwise, not up and down. Now I'll walk through my layout for the shooter Prodeus. First, I set Trackpad As Mouse and adjust the sensitivity so that a full swipe, starting before the left edge of the trackpad and ending after the right edge, does a 360-degree turn in-game. I also lower the vertical scale to 40%. This combination makes it easy to do fast yet accurate horizontal turns while still keeping ample range to look up and down vertically. Now, most people will probably want a lower sensitivity than what I use, and a common recommendation is to set it so a full swipe does a 180 instead. If you want something in between, you can first find the 360 per swipe sensitivity, but multiply it by your desired factor, such as 0.7 or 0.8, to get your ideal sensitivity. In fact, after setting my desired rotation and smoothing, which I'll talk about next, I find I have to slightly cut my sensitivity to about 0.9 of the default 360 per swipe value. That's a 10% reduction. I still like to find the default 360 per swipe sensitivity because I use this value as the basis for my joystick, flickstick, and gyro sensitivities. You'll see how in a bit. My ideal rotation for all shooters is around 20. Here's one way to find your personal rotation value. Open Chrome and go to Klecky.com. Adjust the sensitivity so a full swipe stays within the screen, then swipe back and forth with your eyes closed in a relaxed fashion. Focus on the ends. If the cursor tends to be higher at the right end than the left, increase rotation to compensate. If it ends up lower, decrease it. Once it seems level on average, try it in a game with your desired sensitivity and vertical scale settings, and refine the rotation value as necessary. Next, smoothing. Personally, I like to increase or even max out smoothing. The effect is subtle, but it does seem to help reduce choppiness without adding noticeable latency to my eyes. Higher smoothing does also slightly reduce finer control, but I use gyro to aim, which more than compensates for that. In fact, I quite like the complementary combination of trackpad for smooth turning and looking, and gyro for precise aim. Next, while I like trackball emulation for desktop mode, for shooters I turn off trackball mode completely. If you like trackball flicking but have trouble controlling it, you can keep it on but try using high friction. You can also adjust the vertical friction scale specifically. Warning though, I've heard there is a bug where this scale value works the opposite of what the description says, so increasing the value may actually reduce vertical friction, which you probably don't want for shooters. Now for an optional but very useful technique, making the trackpad press fire a different action depending on which side of the trackpad you press. To achieve this, first in the trackpad dropdown, select Creative Mode Shift at the bottom. This will add a second set of trackpad options. For the mode shift behavior, choose Directional Pad. Bind your desired actions to the directions. I like to use it for fast weapon selection without a menu. Next, go to the D-pad settings. For the mode shift button, choose right pad click. For the layout, choose 4-way, no overlap. Uncheck requires click because we already had to click to get into this mode as we just configured above. Now, I like to raise the dead zone to 29,000, so I practically have to press the edges of the trackpad. And this gives me more room for a center press action. To add this, I first set the outer ring command radius to match the dead zone. Then, most importantly, I invert the outer ring command. This effectively turns it into an inner circle command instead. For Prodeus, I made this reload. For some other games, I bind it to melee. Now, in this case, there is no actual command on trackpad click, and without a command, the UI doesn't let you adjust settings like press threshold or haptic intensity. To get around that, I bind click to cleared from parent, which basically means do nothing. I use it as a dummy command to enable the click options, allowing me to change the aforementioned values. Now, if you want to create an even more customized menu on Trackpad Click, you can use an action layer and a custom touch menu. Gone JJ Games and Nerdness already have great guides on these concepts, so I'll just link those in the description below. For me, a mode shift D-pad based menu is usually good enough. Now, for the left pad, I honestly don't use it much, but it can be really handy for games that have a lot of bindable actions like strategy games or MMOs. Here, I just changed it to a swipe-based D-pad with the A button on click for menu navigation. But it's yet another way you can add many actions onto a single pad. So you could, for example, have one action for each of the 4 swipe directions, then add a mode shift or action layer as mentioned earlier to activate a different action depending where on the trackpad you press. If you do this though, you may want to decrease the swipe sensitivity so a press isn't interpreted as a swipe. You can also adjust settings like rotation and momentum, similar to the Trackpad As Mouse mode. Let's move on to gyro. I suggest using the new Gyro To Mouse option near the bottom of the dropdown, which allows better precision than the old As Mouse mode. For the dots per 360 value, if you don't care to use flickstick, a quick and dirty way to approximate it is to take the trackpad 360 per swipe sensitivity I mentioned earlier and multiply it by 6. The magic number is 6. So for Prodeus, the 360 per swipe sensitivity is about 400%, and 400 times 6 is 2400. This actually happens to be about the exact dots per 360 value for this game. If you want to learn how I get the exact value for flickstick, subscribe to my channel because that requires a whole new video on its own. For the purpose of configuring gyro here, this should be good enough. Then you can set your desired multiplier, but for me, I usually like the default 2.5x. The only other setting I change for Gyro To Mouse is to reduce the speed Deadzone and just rely on the precision speed setting alone, but that's just personal preference. Now for the joysticks. Because I prefer to use the trackpad to turn and select weapons, I actually don't need the right joystick at all, but I still configure it because sometimes I just like to mix things up and go back to sticks for fun. So here's where I have to talk about mixed input. Many games don't handle simultaneous gamepad and mouse commands gracefully, and in the case of Prodeus, it seems to cause some random, sudden changes in sensitivity. In cases like this, you should either use a layout with only gamepad commands or a layout with only keyboard and mouse commands, and I always go the keyboard mouse route. So for the right joystick, I use joystick and mouse instead of regular joystick mode. This mode controls like a normal joystick, but sends mouse movement to the game. To configure sensitivity, I again take that 360 per swipes trackpad sensitivity value I found earlier and divide it by 2. I can easily do that in my head and that value usually feels good to me. So 400 divided by 2 is 200. And just like the trackpad, I cut the vertical scale to 40%. I like an extra wide response curve which makes it easier to make fine adjustments with slight nudges of the stick while still allowing fast turns by fully deflecting the stick. Finally, I use a custom deadzone of about 1000 or lower for the inner, and set the outer to the end at 32,000, maximizing the analog range of the joystick. For the left joystick, I change it to a D-pad with the directions bound to WASD keys, and the order in the UI here is WSAD. In the D-pad settings, I always try analog emulation first. For most games, it doesn't work well, but for some shooters like Prodeus here, it actually works great. But to get it to feel smoother, I had to decrease the analog emulation active percent to 1 and increase the analog emulation pulse time to 100. For games where I can't get analog emulation to work smoothly, I instead use 8-way radio with overlap and set the overlap region size to a symmetrical 8000. It's not fully analog, but most shooters are designed to be playable with the keyboard where you don't have analog movement anyway, and you can turn 360 degrees with your aim to compensate for that. Finally, I increased the outer ring command radius to 29,000 and bind it to shift so I automatically sprint when I fully deflect the left joystick. If the game has a start-stop sprinting system like Borderlands, I set this to turbo. If the game has an auto-run option turned on, I either turn it off or I invert the outer ring command because usually with auto-run it turns shift into walk instead of run. Let's talk about the triggers now. So I actually like to swap the conventional bindings and make left trigger left click and right trigger right click. And it's not for the reason you might be thinking. I do this to move primary fire off of the same hand as my aiming thumb, which eliminates thumb jitter and strain while firing. And I actually make this change everywhere, not just for shooters. So in desktop mode with this scheme, it feels so much more controllable and satisfying to click, drag, and throw icons and windows with my thumb using Trackball mode. Something to remember though is that if you bind anything directly to soft pull or full pull on the triggers, remember to go into the settings and turn analog output off. Otherwise, that action will still fire as well, which you probably don't want. Also, I like to zero out the trigger threshold point completely, because the deck's triggers already seem to have a large built-in mechanical dead zone. Now here's a cool trick to add satisfying haptics on the trigger. I add an extra dummy command cleared from parent on L2 soft pull. In the settings, I set it to turbo, use a faster repeat rate, and set haptics to high. This not only feels good, but is actually useful if you have different commands on soft pull and full pull that you need to distinguish. For example, if you're new to gyro, instead of activating it on stick or pad touch, you might want to only activate it on trigger soft pull instead. Then bind fire to full pull. This way, you don't need a dedicated button just for gyro activation. Both the lower trigger threshold point and added haptics make it easier to feel and know when you've activated gyro in the soft pull range, while reducing the risk that you press too far and fire at full pull unintentionally. For the D-pad, I just left it default for menu navigation. Last but not least, the buttons. So I love being able to keep my thumb on the trackpad and use my other fingers to press the back buttons instead of using the face buttons. So now I only use ABXY for weapon or item selection. I'll usually bind the bumpers to grenade throwing or other special abilities that the game has, but for Prodeus, it's just bound to selecting fist and a redundant reload binding for when I play with stick instead of pad. Now for my favorite buttons, the back buttons. First off, if you think they're too hard to press, make sure you're pressing the inner edges of them into the back of the screen. It should be much easier to do it that way compared to pressing it at the center into the grips. If you still have trouble, you might want to look into adhesive rubber grip pads you can buy online. Now, I usually bind L4 to jump and L5 to crouch. I don't think Prodeus has crouching though, so I bound L5 to use instead. But notice the extra long press use. It's a turbo use, which is nifty for games where you're trying to find random secret doors along walls like in Doom, or opening many loot boxes like in Borderlands. But for the regular press use, I go into the settings and uncheck interruptible. This makes it so I can still press use normally because often I don't want turbo. So I can do a normal short press to fire a single use action, or a long press and hold to fire a turbo use. If the game has dash, I'll also usually bind that to a back button. In Borderlands, I'd actually bind ADS to R4, which feels more comfortable than holding the right trigger all the time. For Prodeus here though, I just bound the extra buttons to even more weapon selection, so it really just depends on the game. And that's it. So with all these changes, I not only find playing shooters on the deck tolerable, it's actually my favorite way to play them now, believe it or not. Now, I know I won't be going pro in Apex with this layout, but for fast-paced boomer shooters and PvE games, it feels very ergonomic and intuitive. Going back and forth, I found that trackpad and gyro actually requires less overall muscle effort than keyboard and mouse or any stick-based gamepad scheme. I love being able to quickly look all around me with swift flicks of the thumb, then effortlessly recenter. I also love being able to make full use of both my left and right fingers, thumbs, and arms in perfect harmony. Now, while this might sound like a lot to set up, the first time is the most painful. Then you can save and modify your own personalized template across games. But I actually like to do it from scratch for each game, and it's almost second nature now. Now, I know a lot of you are already willing to spend hours tweaking graphical settings and FSR and TDP and all that jazz. So if you're willing to do that, this really doesn't take much time in comparison. And actually, compared to graphical settings, I actually think your control settings are far more reusable across games. So try it out, you have nothing to lose. With that, I'll end this video on some more trackpad and gyro gameplay, so you can judge for yourself how well it works. Thanks for watching and happy gaming!